This might be the final installment of How the Great Religions Began by Joseph Gaer, Book 3, The Advance of the One God. Part 5, The Reformation, Out of the Dark Ages. Section 2, The Holy Crusades. Long before the break in the church took place, as we have seen, there arose the flaming sword of the desert, Mohammedanism, and it sent its armies all over the earth to convert all people to the belief in Allah and Muhammad as prophet. And mainstream Islam passes on the narrations that those who fight to produce converts are cursed by God. And Islam has never allowed wars merely because people believe something different. Into the hands of Mohammedanism fell Jerusalem, the city sacred to the Christians. For there Jesus had often preached, and there Jesus was crucified. Rumors began to spread that Mohammedans had desecrated all the landmarks in Jerusalem sacred to the Christians. So, making up stuff to start a war, right? One man, known to us as Peter the Hermit, began to rouse the people of France to gather into crusading armies to conquer Jerusalem for the glory of the faith. Those who enlisted in the army of the Crusades were offered forgiveness of their sins. So, through murder, still some Christians think that they can get forgiveness for their sins. And we have cases of this that aren't usually reported on the news, but you can find them across the country, of people, even in Vancouver, Washington. There was a Christian who thought that he would acquire some merit by murdering a Muslim woman. The police didn't treated it like an accident, despite his hate speech prior and witnesses saying it looked like it was intentional. Thousands of sinners who sought forgiveness, and thousands of believers who were eager to destroy the Mohammedans, and thousands of men who were eager for adventure, and thousands of barbarians who loved to go to war, joined in the Crusades and marched to Jerusalem. And those who are forced to say something just to survive aren't blamed for it. And people realize that people do things out of fear that don't really believe. And they'd rather have one real believer than a bunch of people faking it. So this is just completely unacceptable behavior on even the grounds that, well, the ends justify the means. There'll be more Christians. It's like, will there be more Christians? Will Christianity get diluted? There were several crusades during the 12th and 13th centuries, and Jerusalem was conquered and held as a Christian state for some years. The worst sufferers of those crusades, however, were not the Mohammedans, but the Christians of the East. Thousands of crusaders were on the way to Jerusalem, swooped down upon their land, and demanded to be fed and housed. And they even tried to supplant the Greek Orthodox Church in Constantinople with the Roman Catholic Church. Some of the leaders of the Greek Orthodox Church suspected that the Crusades were organized not so much against the Mohammedans, which they would never call themselves, in Jerusalem, as against the Christians of the East who had broken away from the Roman Church. And, the Cathars were also fought. But the Crusades failed to conquer the Mohammedans, whom they had started out to conquer, and they failed to subject the Greek Orthodox Church. What they did succeed in doing was to create such evils that some people believe We suffer from their effects to this day. As an outcome of the Crusades arose an evil known as indulgences, and this led to very important results, as we shall see a little later in this chapter. The Crusades completed the break between the Church of the East and the Church of the West. Many times since, attempts has been made to unite the Greek Orthodox Church with the Roman Church, but to this day they stand divided. And a Muslim is what these people would be called, but also certain policies, like there's people who believe in holy war in the Christian sense after the Crusades. But before the Crusades, they thought, but after the Crusades, well, it's been done by these other people, and these other people do it. It's like, no, doesn't justify it. Section 3, the power of Rome. Meanwhile, the dominion of the Church of Rome became greater and greater. It controlled almost all of Europe, and missionaries were sent out to the east and to the west and to the north and to the south to convert mankind to Christianity. And the power of Rome grew and grew. To disobey the Pope's command was considered not only a soul-destroying sin, but also an offense against the government. In his person, the Pope combined all the powers of heaven and earth. Not only was he called the Vicar of Christ, but he was also known as the Prince over all the nations and kingdoms. Delusions of grandeur, apparently. When a pope died, another was elected. The way we elect our president. The difference was, of course, that the popes were not elected by all the people, but by a group of cardinals, called the College of Cardinals. Isn't there 40? There was also another very important difference between the elections of a pope and our elections of a president. The pope, as soon as he was elected, could make any law he wished, and the people had to obey it. One of these laws made by the pope was that people had to pay to the church a portion of all their earnings. We call that taxes. Well, in the Bible it's called tithing, because the Cohen-type priest decided, don't give your alms to the poor, give it to us. We'll take care of the poor. And other things, But more than that, the Pope could decide what people should read and what they should not read, what people might study and what they might not study. And whatever the Pope decided was law. What happens to people who disobey the law? They are punished. And so the Church punished all people who disobeyed the commands of the Pope and his cardinals and bishops. Some people did not think they ought to pay the taxes the Pope demanded, and some people wished to decide for themselves what books to read, and some people wished to study some of the subjects the Pope prohibited, and some people did not wish to keep all the holidays the Church proclaimed. Well, no one did, because they had so many saint days for their 10,000 saints, but it varied per area. These people, when they were caught, were brought before a tribunal and tried, and if found guilty, they were severely punished. The more the people were punished, the greater became the number of those who objected to some of the rules of the Church, and the more people revolted against the rule of the Church, the severer became the punishment. Then, about the 13th century, the Church of Rome set up what is known in history as the Inquisition. The Inquisition was a new method of converting people to Christianity. If men or women or children refused to accept Christianity, they were tortured until they died. Even the early Christians, before Constantine, who were tortured and killed, and fed to the lions in Rome, and who are known to us as martyrs, were not treated more cruelly than the non-Christians during the Inquisition. The Inquisition lasted over 200 years, and thousands of people were killed by its orders in the most barbarous manner. And I probably shouldn't sing the Inquisition song because it's maybe under rights, and someone's gonna flag my account. He covered the Inquisition song. Okay, fine. People were burned alive on a slow fire, or they were crushed to death by heavy weights, or they were torn to pieces by cruel instruments. The cruel instruments of the Inquisition was not reserved for the Jews and heathens only. It was also directed against Christians, no matter how pious, who dared to utter a word against the rule of the Pope, or dared to believe anything the Church did not sanction. Some brave Christians wrote books against the cruelty of the Inquisition and the despotic power of the Pope. These people were caught and tortured to death in the Inquisition torture chambers. And before Ataturk, for a couple hundred years, you had Turkish people saying, this is not an Islamic state, and here's why. From all sorts of groups. Some of them were Shia, some of them were Sufis, some were Sunni, some were non-denominational, some were of other faiths, but they knew that there was no Islamic state there. But Christianity, not so. As long as there's some in the name of Jesus there somewhere, they can pretty much sanction whatever they please. That is why we have separation of church and state, or at least in theory, there's areas where that's not quite true. But there were people then, as there always are, who were ready to die for the truth. And such people arose in the name of humanity to protest against the Inquisition. Even though threatened with death, the Inquisition, like the Crusades, started out against the non-Christians and ended in persecution of their own brethren. But the voice of justice was not stilled. The power of the truth and protest of the men slain was greater than the power of the sword that killed them. The more cruel the methods of the Inquisition became, the greater became the number of those who protested it. Such were the conditions of Europe towards the end of the 15th century, when Martin Luther was born in Germany. And hadn't it been for a couple hundred years, the people were told, people were learning translations of the Bible in languages like English and German, and some was in France, but those were the ones that came first, right? And they were told not to pass these things on and not to, So some people died to render the Bible into English and German and stuff like this. Martin Luther was the start of the change. So Martin Luther is section 4. But Martin Luther, there's some problems with him too. Martin Luther was the son of Hans and Marguerite Luther, poor peasants of Eisleben, Germany. Wasn't it called Deutschland? Or there wasn't a united Germany at that point, I don't think, in the way that we think of Germany now. Though the Luthers were poor people, well, there was a German group of people. Though the Luthers were poor people and had 6 other children, they gave Martin a good education. When Martin was old enough, it became his ambition to go through college. His parents did not have the means to help him go through a college course, and Martin tried to make his way through a law school by singing in the streets for his meals and needs. Many students in Germany in those days supported themselves in that way. People knew that these were not beggars, but hungry students. And now, at one door, and now at another, a woman would appear and call the singer into the house for a meal. Maybe I should sing for a living too. Martin had almost completed his course of law when a very dear friend of his died. The sudden death of one so dear to him made a strong impression upon the young Luther. He immediately gave up his law course and began to study religion, because at that time most of the books were on religion. He entered a monastery, and 2 years later, he was ordained into the priesthood. In the monastery, Martin Luther's quick intelligence and learning brought him to the attention of his superiors, and at the early age of 25, he was appointed professor of philosophy at the University of Wittenberg. He taught at the university and preached in the church he was given, and he still found time to study the organization of the Catholic Church, its history, and its rule. Because there was no TV. Though he was a very devout Roman Catholic, there were many things about the behavior and rule of the Pope and the clergy that seemed wrong to Luther. He particularly objected to the Inquisition as being unchristian and evil. No man can comprehend, or ought to command, or by force compel any man's belief, he said. He could not understand how the Pope or any of his followers hoped to force a man to accept Christianity as they taught it, if he did not accept it in his heart first. Several years later, Luther and another monk were sent to Rome on a mission. When Luther came in sight of Rome, he fell upon his knees and exclaimed, "Hail to thee, holy Rome, thrice holy for the blood of martyrs shed here." So, the power of blood magic confirmed, and soon will arise a series of grimoires that ask for blood magic. Well, that's not written here, but it's true. It was not long, though, before Luther realized that Rome was not the holy city he had expected. He learned that the people of Rome lived shameful lives, and when a man claimed to be a good Christian, they called him a fool. Martin Luther's greatest disappointment came when he reached the dwelling of the Pope. Pope Julius II lived in a castle surrounded by wealth and served as a king. People came to him and kissed his feet and begged favors, and the Pope, God's representative on earth, sold his grace for a price. Luther returned to Wittenberg, a very unhappy man. His experience in Rome had convinced him that the entire government of the Pope was somehow wrong. But he did not yet know the rules of the Pope could be changed for the better, that good Christians could live the good life without the aid of the Pope in Rome had as yet not occurred to Luther. Several years after Luther returned from Rome, Pope Julius II died, and Pope Leo X came to power. The new pope, who wished to outdo all the popes that had come before him, wished to build a church, the like of which had never been built before. In order to raise money for the great church to be called St. Peter's Dome, Pope Leo sent out his agents to sell indulgences all over the Christian world. The Pope and his clergy had a complete list of all the sins a man might commit and the punishment for each sin. There were some sins for which the sinner could obtain forgiveness through repentance, but there were other sins for which the sinner had to suffer damnation. So, that's a little too much for us to deal with. We're going to act like you're condemned, like God can't forgive what he wants of people who are actually trying to repent and trying to make up for things. But during the Crusades, complete forgiveness of all sins was promised to those who were ready to sacrifice their lives in a war for the faith. And I would agree with that to a term, that those are willing to die in battle. But the goal isn't to die in battle, and it's not to force the faith. It's to protect the rights of others, to defend oneself. But it is in the right way, not killing in the name of, merely killing in the way of. There's a difference. Fighting in the way of. That's the difference between what these people did. After the Crusades, the sacrifice and money paid into the Pope's treasury began to be considered a substitute. This payment of money to the Pope to have their sins forgiven by the Lord was known as buying indulgences. That suicidal tendency song about "send me your money" somebody with their video about 80s or 90s preachers or whatever. Yeah, I think it was 90s preachers. This kind of fits in with that very strongly. These indulgences were sold wherever there were Christians, and of course, the greatest sinners were the best buyers. Not only did the clergy sell indulgences, but even private tradesmen dealt in them and received a commission of 33 1/3%. Indulgences, which really mean the mercy of the Lord, were dealt in as people nowadays deal in stocks and bonds. To Luther, all this merchandising of the forgiveness of the Lord seemed wrong. He could not understand how it was possible for a man to kill another and then buy, for a certain sum of money, indulgences from the Pope's agents or a broker, and in that way become innocent before the Lord. So if you were really rich and you wanted a raping budget, the church was willing to comply. Quite literally, there's cases of that. If you got angry on occasion and killed people who didn't deserve it, if you were rich, you can get away with it. Nowadays, we pay lawyers, right? When Pope Leo X sent out his men to sell indulgences in order to raise money for St. Peter's Dome, Luther wrote a number of letters to priests in Germany asking them to protest against the business of indulgences, but these priests were afraid to interfere with the work of the Pope. They knew the power and cruelty of the Inquisition. Just then, Johann Tetzel, representative of the Pope in Germany, arrived to begin the auction of indulgences. Because apparently they had limited forgiveness, so they wanted to get as little as possible. 5. The pin that tilted a crown. On the night of October 30th, 1517, in the Vulgar area, Prince Frederick of Saxony dreamt that he saw a monk come up to a church and write upon its door. The words this monk wrote were so long that they could be seen 6 leagues away, and the pen he wrote with was so large that it reached from Germany to Rome. And so, obviously, if they're exaggerating things like this, there's going to be serious flaws in their historical accounts. As the monk of Frederick's dream, I'm sorry, I forgot that for a second. As the monk of Frederick's dream moved his pen, it brushed against the head of the Pope in Rome and almost threw off his crown. That was a strange dream for Prince Frederick to dream. But the very next day, October 31st, 1517, Protestants, it would make sense for them to add this to their Halloween celebrations. Because Halloween, of course, is a Christian holiday to compete with Samhain that starts the week later. Martin Luther appeared before the castle church of Wittenberg and nailed upon its wooden door a long inscription in Latin. People passing by near the church stopped to read the notice, in which Luther denounced the sale of indulgences. The news was soon carried all over the town, and a crowd gathered about the church. Without Luther's knowledge, his challenge was translated from Latin into German. From German, it was translated into other European languages. Before 4 weeks were over, it was known all over Germany and all over Europe. The news reached the Pope, but he only said, "A drunken German wrote it. When he is sober, he will think differently." But the sale of indulgences fell off rapidly. The angered Pope then issued an order called a papal bull to throw Luther out of the clergy and to prohibit any man from reading Luther's writings or from having anything to do with him. A copy of this order was sent to Luther. When the order reached Luther, he burned it in public. That marked the final break between Luther and the Church of Rome. No, it didn't. He wanted to reunite. But the Protestants often overlook that. Oh, well, maybe let's reunite the Protestants and the Catholic Church. Luther had many admirers and followers who agreed with him in his criticism of the power of Rome, and they encouraged him to go on with his attacks. Luther did not disappoint him. He lectured and wrote many books on the subject of the power of the Pope. In one of these he wrote, "The Church of Rome, formerly known as the most holy of all churches, has become the most lawless den of thieves, the very kingdom of sin, death, and hell." Martin was a tireless worker. During his lifetime he wrote over 400 books and pamphlets. He translated the Bible into German, and to this day his translation is used in Germany as the King James Version of the Bible is used among the English-speaking people. And he found enough time to preach and to organize the churches that broke away from the Church of Rome. The Nazis had their own translation of the Bible, in which the book of Esther, which does not mention God at all, and kind of sets a bad example. Let's go sleep with the rich guy. He's going to marry one of us, right? Or, I guess in modern society, that's not too bad of an example. But there were still some changes to be done to the Bible, other than translating it. Before he died, his teachings called Lutheranism spread over Germany, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The churches organized by him became known as the Protestant churches, and so the dream of Prince Frederick almost came true. And I guess, going to close this part for now, because I don't want to stop in the middle of the section. There's a Lutheran church in, Portland, Oregon, that they're selling out, they're renting space to an OTO lodge. So, Lutheran church is hurt. Obviously, they wouldn't, some New Age religion. Good dramas, good discussions, but Lutheranism is, I guess, opened some doorways between them and the New Age in that location.